Thanks, Millie, and thank you for putting together such a great panel and assembling such a smart audience tonight. Thanks very much. So it's bang on 7, and we know you're busy. We always start these sessions on time. Everything else they do at the Frontline Club is late. So what she's just told you isn't strictly true. That these sessions start on time and end on time, and they involve you. So please don't wait till the end to say you did not get the briefing you hoped for. Please let me know as we're going along. This is about briefing ourselves on this topic, which is 10 years of war, the longest war in American history, although not the longest in British history. We've done 100 years, I think. So I would like to ask the panel to kindly introduce themselves briefly, and all of the people in the room have paid £12 for your answer to the question, how do the Afghan people view the last 10 years since the US-led invasion, and how have their lives been changed? Would you kindly give us a response to that, even if it's not an answer, and please tell us a little bit about your life, starting with you, Dawood.
Well, my name is Dawood Azami. I work for the BBC World Service. I won a few awards. I was based in London, then I moved to Kabul to run the BBC World Service Bureau, and I recently moved back to London. I'm also a visiting scholar. I give lectures in different universities, and the World Economic Forum selected me as a young global leader. So this is YGL, Young Global Leader. And I've been covering Afghanistan and the region for more than 12 years for the BBC. And shall I give the answer now, or
no? Please do. If you've got the answer, you can have the whole hour and a half.
Okay. So I think for most Afghans, the past decade has been of 1 step forward and 2 steps back. There are signs of improvement, media, you all know about that, education, reconstruction, and telecommunication. But the biggest challenge that Afghans have today, or in the past 10 years, is insecurity, followed by bad governance. You know that violence has increased in the past 10 years, especially this year. There were several high-profile killings in different parts of the country. And in 2010, last year, around 10,000 Afghans were killed. Afghans, civilians, and police, and members of the army. So these are the biggest challenges that Afghans had in the past 10 years, insecurity and bad governance.
Thank you. Lucy?
Yes, hello. Thank you for letting me come here tonight. I'm from London originally, and I first went to the region in 1999 to Pakistan and met someone who invited me to work with her in Kandahar during the Taliban. So I worked there on community forum projects and urban development, and then had to leave when the USS Cole was bombed by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda were obviously there. Returned in just after 9/11 and stayed there till the end of 2005 in various roles in relation to our so-called kind of political engagement with the country. I was an election monitor at the first lawyer Jirga in 2002. I was a freelance journalist. I worked on the currency exchange project, worked for the International Crisis Group on transitional justice. And I have recently produced a book called The Afghan Solution, The Inside Story of Abdul Haq, the CIA, and How Western Hubris Lost Afghanistan, which you can buy at the back somewhere at the end of the evening. It's about a peace plan that was existed already by the time of 9/11 with the ex-king and major factions led by Commander Abdul Haq. And for various reasons, our intelligence agencies chose not to follow this. And the book was really an investigation of why they didn't and what we chose to do instead, which I document various turning points of the intervention and the various political and military mistakes that I felt were made in comparison to what he proposed. As to the last 10 years, I feel it's been a massive disappointment. I remember when I was in Kabul in spring 2002, traveling around monitoring district level elections, that there was a real feeling by Afghans that maybe we were going to turn the corner, that after 23 years of war, there was hope for a rebirth of the nation. And unfortunately, we squandered all that, and I describe that in the book.
And did you mention that you were the former political advisor to the EU ambassador in Kabul?
I didn't mention that, but that I was doing towards the end of my time there, yeah.
Thank you. And Edward?
Hi, my name is Edward Girardet, Eddie Girardet, and I made the mistake of beginning to cover Afghanistan in October 1979, hence the white hair. I went out as a young reporter and have covered Afghanistan on and off throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And I've actually just written a book called Killing the Cranes, a reporter's journey through 3 decades of war in Afghanistan. It's more than 3 decades, actually. Looks at the situation today, but taking the past into context as well. I'll just jump quickly to what Afghans think. I think one of the big problems is that there have been so many mistakes made and so much incredible arrogance and incompetence amongst the intelligence agencies, amongst the politicals, the Bush administration, the Tony Blair administration. We went in Afghanistan. I thought we would have learned from the 1980s, where we supported a lot of the extremists creating the monsters who are actually now fighting US, British and NATO forces in Afghanistan today. I think a lot of Afghans in the beginning, they were very excited. I mean, I went out to Herat, for example, in 2002 with Ahmed Rashid. We found a lot of optimism particularly amongst the women, the health workers, the teachers, who felt that now, finally, after all these years of war, things are going to change. But in fact, they didn't change. And I think this disappointment has led to a very broad perception that we have now become the new occupiers of Afghanistan, and that's the situation today, I think.
Thank you. And your first trip there was in 1979?
October 79.
That's the Soviet, still in occupation?
Just before the Soviets arrived, I went, I was actually extremely nervous about going there.
I mean, and the Afghans didn't like that either, I don't
They didn't like that either, no. So.
Okay, and to you, Horia, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Horia Mosadiq, and I work on Afghanistan, and I'm an Afghan myself for the past 18 years. So I have been journalist, and I have been working as a human rights defender and women's rights activist since then. So I was mainly engaged in documenting war crimes and human rights violations in Afghanistan, mainly after 1992 when the civil war broke down in Afghanistan. So right now I'm working with Amnesty International as an Afghanistan researcher for the past 3 years. So regarding your question, Amnesty International have released a report or a scorecard, which says 10 years, Afghanistan 10 years on, slow progress and failed promises. So in this report card, we actually give a score to the Afghan government and its international partners on where the failures are, where the progresses are, and what are the shortcomings.
Thank you, and we'll hear that in detail. So I wondered if you'd agree with me that the surprising way to begin this would be to ask everyone to discuss some of the positives of the international action, because we know there's a lot of pessimism, and we'll get to it. But I thought it would be intriguing for everyone in the room who thought they'd come and hear a diet of misery. The women-hating, women-killing Taliban, who we now may be about to talk to, can we start there? Has life improved for women in Afghanistan? And can I ask you to join in, audience, as we talk about some positives of the last 10 years? Would you like to begin with that question? Is it better to be a woman living in Afghanistan now, or amid the violence of the misogynist regime a decade ago?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you compare the situation now in Afghanistan with a decade ago, there have been tremendous positive changes. Like I myself, I was living in Afghanistan, and I went to Afghanistan several times after I left during the Taliban. So to be honest, I think even an animal had much more value than a woman. I was beaten myself by the Taliban simply because I dared to put my burqa up to look at a color of a piece of textile. I couldn't see it through the screen of my burqa. So yes, the life have changed. If you look at the figures, for example, right now we have more than 7 million kids back to school. Girls are making more than 2 million of these figure, which is like before, like at the time of the Taliban, there was less than 1 million kids at school, almost no girls. Access to health, access to education, freedom of expression, freedom of media, there have been a lot of changes, and also women's political participation that you have mentioned. The Afghanistan new constitution is guaranteeing equality of women and men, and at the same time women are having 25% of the parliamentarian seats through a constitutional quota, which is a huge progress, even not during the Taliban, but even if you compare it with the regimes before the Taliban.
Would you like to react, anyone? Add anything or disagree?
Well, I just want to add a couple of more points. Women have quotas in the parliament, in the National Assembly and provincial assemblies. So there are several examples of women who won their seats in open competition, not in the women quota. So that shows the progress. And Afghanistan has more women in the parliament than any other country in that region.
Probably more than Egypt, they don't like women running their revolution either in Egypt, do they? That's run by the military. So you're agreeing with our speaker here, better than the Egyptians already.
And they're in the media. If you go to television station, there are more than 20 television stations. So on every television screen you see women.
Right. So Lucy, would you like to comment on this?
I think I'd possibly be a little bit more circumspect than Horia, who I would not want to disagree with openly because she's an Afghan woman. But I mean, when I first went to Kabul and I was talking to some of the women who were working in our World Food Programme bakery projects who I was working with at the time, one of the ladies had recently been imprisoned by the Taliban in the summer 2001. And when I said to them, well, you must be, I was still quite new and naive, and I said, you must be so happy to see Masood's poster all over the lampposts of Kabul. What a relief, the Taliban have gone. And actually the women started a tirade and they started saying, we are not happy to see these people here. They are not from Kabul. Don't you know what they did to the women during the early 90s, during the years of the Civil War, when, you know, terrible atrocities were committed, various massacres and targeting of women and very foul treatment of women, equal, I think, on occasion to the way that the Taliban behaved. And also when I went to the Panjshir Valley to monitor some elections there, I really was expecting that this was going to be the place of enlightenment, that Masood had run lycées and allowed women to be educated. But actually, the women were not allowed to participate in the elections.
But you're not claiming this is better than the period?
I'm saying that I think it's not helpful always to talk in sort of, I'm not saying Horia, but I have seen in the press quite a lot of black and white. It's a very absolute, either us or them, either the Taliban or the Northern Alliance, and there have been atrocities on all sides.
And to you, Edward,
I would just point out that there are elements within the government, different parts of the government, which are far more Taliban than Taliban. I mean, Herat, for example, which used to be a seat of culture, a seat of education, openness, is actually a very hard line nowadays. And but I also just want to very quickly, with the education, you have areas such as Kunar, which is where the fighting actually began in the 1978 against education by the Kabul regime, trying to impose it, the Halkis. Almost every village now has a school, and a lot of girls are going to school. So it's rather ironic that you're seeing these highly conservative areas, actually the parents insisting their kids go to school, primarily as a result of being refugees in Pakistan.
So audience, does anyone want to take issue, because we've got lots to cover? The impression is that life has improved for women in Afghanistan. There's a question at the back, if you'd like to say yes or no, and then we'll move on. And we've got a blockbuster film to show you in a minute. So the question is women, that's the only question we're asking at the moment.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm from ActionAid. We've got a report out this week on women in Afghanistan. We did a survey of women, 1,000 women, over the summer, and it's quite interesting because people talk all the time about what women in Afghanistan want, but they hardly ever ask them. So we found that 66% said they felt safer now than 10 years ago, 72% believe their lives are better than 10 years ago, and a massive 9 out of 10 are worried about the return of the Taliban. Right,
and we're coming to that. Panel, would you like, Lucy, you're the one who seems to say don't get carried away with saying it's better for women. Would you like to correspond?
I think that's fair enough as long as the international coalition is still there. I mean, what are we going to leave behind when we start pulling out? You know, I think the structure, we're talking about transition and transitioning over to Afghan national security forces, as though they can really prop up what we have sustained for the last 10 years. But actually, I think it's very, very flimsy. And because we had no transitional justice at the beginning to hold to account perpetrators from various regimes, whether it was Taliban or Northern Alliance or whatever, we absolutely failed in transitional justice. And I'm not talking about building courts and having court cases held. I'm talking about holding people to account for past abuses in the way that we did in the Balkans and Sierra Leone, but we have made these people our partners in government. And now wonder why we have this sort of crisis of impunity there.
Anything else from the room about the role, the life for women in Afghanistan? Yes to you in the middle, and if you'd kindly wait for a microphone, then the watching millions on the internet can hear you as well.
I wanted to ask the panel what they thought of the programme, the BBC programme Afghan's Women's Hour, which was running, I don't know if it still is, but it was a radio service for Afghan women to share all the atrocities they'd been through. And you know, press is a key to democracy, and I wondered what you thought of
Dawood, do you know about this programme? Do you want to respond?
Well, the program doesn't exist anymore. It was closed last year in 2010. Well, it was a popular program. We started this program in 1980s. Then it was closed for a while. Then we restarted it, and then after 9/11, this was the third phase of the Women Hour. It was a weekly program. So it started with 10 minutes, then finally it was half an hour. It was very popular. We were talking to women in different parts of the country, we were educating them, and all sorts of issues that they have. So they were sending us letters, and they were calling us. It was a popular program, but there's no money anymore.
Right. But it must have been revolutionary when it started, a woman to be heard on the radio.
Yeah, in refugee camps, there were surveys in the 80s in refugee camps in Pakistan. 82% of the people, adults, were listening to the BBC in the 80s.
So would anyone else like to talk about any other positives of the last decade? We're moving on from women now. There's a lot of consensus on this subject. There's a warning from Lucy. Can anyone else give us a positive of the last decade of war in Afghanistan, from the audience or the panel? No.
Could I just say one more point before we move off the women's subject? I think if you're measuring the metrics of success, I think it's important to look at the sort of overall situation of women, not just how many women there are in schools. And I think a good measure of that is the UN Human Development Index, which discusses maternal mortality and infant death and access to clean water and so on, and more humanitarian orientated. And unfortunately, Afghanistan is still on the bottom of that, as it was 10 years ago. It's, I think, 122 out of 123.
Right, but we're still on the issues that are broadly positive. I'm not saying we can't get to these, but in the issues of dividing our time, do you have anything to add on this question of have women's lives got better? The consensus in the room is yes. So if the answer is yes, we will move on.
I'm just talking about positives. I mean, I think one thing which needs to be in mind is that you've had a lot of aid agencies, Aga Khan Foundation, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, Action Aid, who've been working for years in Afghanistan, and some of them working Swedish Committee clandestinely in Afghanistan during the 1980s, have a lot of experience. They do not, and I think this is what's positive, that things are being achieved in many rural areas, slowly. They also, most of these organizations, in fact, I think only 6 out of some 390 or 80, most of them do not use mercenaries or armed protection. They rely, their support comes from the population. They talk with everyone. They talk with the insurgents, they talk with the government, they talk with NATO, they talk with the local communities. And it's a very intelligent approach, which I think the military have more or less ignored. And I think that's one positive. So
it's a start of civil society and not just a sort of Taliban-based dictatorship. And you have a point to make there, sir. And the microphone's been stolen by the woman in front. It's coming to you.
Just to pick up on what Eddie said, I worked for a company that did very similar work to Aga Khan, much smaller, focused purely on Kabul, whose founder we all know quite well. But basically, I agree. I think we felt what we were doing was quite focused, quite a minority thing. It was very unusual for people to come across people who've done the same kind of focused on culture, very positive projects with little negative value.
What's your point about this? What's the positive?
There were a limited number of things going positive. The only thing I was going to say originally was that mobile phones, Afghans, it's the one network you can rely on across the whole country now is network of mobile phones, and off the back of that, television's improved a lot.
Great. No, thank you for that. That's a really useful one. It's a practical example. In Africa, mobile phones have transformed the economy. And in Afghanistan, they didn't have mobile phones 10 years ago. Now they do. And to you, madam, you want to add some positives? Believe me, we've got lots of time for negatives, but would you like to say a positive thing?
Yes, there are great positives in Afghanistan. One of the things is humour. Secondly, women are getting stronger. They've learned English. They've got themselves into decision-making fora. They are extremely strong. Young people want to be educated. They've gone away, got educated and come back, and they want to do something to improve their country. And they're much more vocal about it, and civil society is a lot stronger.
Thank you for saying that. And the lady there who stole the microphone will now give it to you.
Thank you. Another positive that I would like to add, which I think the panel has overlooked, is the fact that we have a government and formal representation within the UN, and ambassadors within a number of countries are actually working now, which I think is a great positive.
The panel is nodding, meaning you're right. They agree they overlooked it. And here's the gentleman over here. And then we're going to show you a film, and we'll get into the many negatives that we can talk about.
Just on the what did the Romans do for us front, it's GSM phones, which I didn't know, people didn't know we didn't have, asphalt road, which we also now have, and much fewer bandits. That's about the three biggest improvements.
Telephones, television, roads.
Internet.
You're less likely to be murdered for being a woman who lifts your veil. These are some of the positives. So anyone else, any big issue to add? No. Right. No. Is it big?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, related to what Lucy said, that at least now when you're walking on the streets, no one is slashing on your head for walking without a male accompany. At least when you're able to go in, no, even in the provinces.
No, this lady wants to disagree. Right, you're going to have to wait for the microphone. Here comes the microphone. Debate on this question about women.
We need to distinguish cities, Kabul, with rural areas.
Okay.
6 months ago, Baghdad's province, Talibs have been lashing in public a woman because she was refusing forced marriage.
Okay, thank you for making that. Do you agree with that distinction?
Yes, absolutely, but it was done by the Taliban, not Afghan government, as a formal government of the country.
Thank you. That's a good point to move on. You've made your distinction. This film was made by Adam Pletz, who's in the room. He went there to ask Afghans what did they know about 9/11. It's 3 minutes long, and what you'll see will surprise you.
Helmand in southern Afghanistan is the province that has borne the brunt of the fighting between the Taliban and coalition forces. What would Afghans in this war-torn province think about 9/11 and its consequences? But first, what would the Marines think of the seemingly obvious question I wanted to put to the Afghans?
Right, it's not seemingly obvious because it's been turned off. So I'm sorry about that. Can you turn it off? When the picture comes back, we'll get to it. Can we give a microphone to Adam? Sorry to stress you, Millie. Can you do 10 things at once? Adam, are you in the room? Sorry. Whilst we're working to restore your picture, would you just tee it up for us?
Well, yeah, this is a film that I made in Helmand in the south. So, like we've been saying, you're going to make a distinction between Kabul and the rest of the provinces in Afghanistan. So, as a cautionary note, what you see here probably wouldn't be true in Kabul. And if you were to wander around Kabul University and start asking the questions that I ask here, I'm sure you'd find that most people knew exactly what 9/11 is. But
don't give it away, please.
This is probably quite representative of.
And just whilst you've got the microphone, and whilst the panel is engaged with the lady at the back, this has come up twice, the difference between Kabul, where there's quite a thriving middle class, I'm told, incidentally, and the rest of the country. Would you all take a moment to reflect on that geographical distinction, just generally, and then we'll go back to the film. Dawood?
Well, life is different in different places. Kabul is not Afghanistan, and Lashkargah is not Afghanistan, as most of the local British journalists go to. I mean, there's much more than Kabul and Lashkargah, and there are places which are very safe in the provinces, and there are places which are safe in the towns. And within Kabul, there are neighborhoods which are as unsafe as Kandahar is. So it's different. I mean, different places would give you different picture. But when we talk about women, life has improved in many parts of the country.
Right, we're not now. We've moved on.
In other areas, it has not improved.
Lucy, would you like to give us some geographical differences in the country?
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand Afghan society is very faished. It's not just divided by mountains, it's divided by ethnic groups, but also it's divided between attitudes, whether they're sort of urban intellectual, modernist, people who sort of tended towards favouring the communism and so on, or whether it's much more agrarian, illiterate, tribal, and so on. And I think my attitude initially in 2002 was, well, urban intellectual democracy, etc., etc. But actually I gravitated towards feeling that in a way the rural areas seem to lead the country, and that's where most people live, and it's where, well, except since the return of many refugees, but it's where a lot of activity takes place, and it's still an agrarian society, and it is still a clannish, tribal society. And I think we shouldn't lose that perspective.
Was it ever the case that people in Afghanistan ever thought the same? Is it a really weird thing to hear when you've spent so much time researching it, that we could even begin to make these assumptions?
I think it's become very predominant, these divisions between the 1960s, these different modes of thought. And these divisions were springing up in Kabul University in the 60s, and I think those divisions are still there. They haven't gone away.
I mean, nearly 80% of the population live in the countryside, and you have to differentiate. Also, one thing we learned from the 1980s onwards was that when you visit a particular area of Afghanistan, you're only seeing this one area. It's representative only of this particular area. I mean, there are hundreds of Afghanistans, there are thousands of Afghanistans. And the mistake I think very often made is that you go to one area and you assume that because it happens there, it happens all over the country. I think the second point was that so much focus has gone on Kabul and the cities. That is one reason why there's so much deep resentment in the countryside amongst many local populations who wonder, you know, what the hell has happened to all this aid they kept hearing about, they keep hearing about. And there is really a divide between the countryside, also drawing people in by the hundreds of thousands into the towns all over the country in search of jobs.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with the panel about the differences between the cities and rural and urban areas. And at the same time, differences between the big cities and small cities around the country. But let's not to forget, and I want to remind again to my friend that of course, the situation is far from perfect for everyone living in Afghanistan, but again, the situation have improved a lot for Afghan people, especially in the areas that are under the control of the government.
And shall we watch Adam's film now, with the lights on?
Helmand in southern Afghanistan is the province that has borne the brunt of the fighting between the Taliban and coalition forces. What would Afghans in this war-torn province think about 9/11 and its consequences? But first, what would the Marines think of the seemingly obvious question I wanted to put to the Afghans?
Okay, I just want to ask you guys, have you heard of 9/11?
Yeah. Indeed.
And what does it mean to you?
After a lengthy silence, which perhaps said more than words could, the lieutenant in charge voiced some thoughts.
The whole approach that we had coming into adulthood, it's kind of hard to separate that, as I said, because we grew up with it and grew up with the shadow of it.
Banadar village is typical of many in Helmand. Poverty and negligible, if any, government services, together with 3 decades of war, have prevented virtually any development. With the high rates of illiteracy and the lack of infrastructure, the villagers essentially live in what's close to a media vacuum. As Helmand goes, however, it's at least relatively peaceful, but there are still very real threats. On the first day the Marines set up next to Banadar, they found some 12 IEDs in and around the village.
Just a heads up. Nice. Got another IED.
Sexy. What is that?
And where is it?
It's right over there. You can actually see them down off the side of the cliff.
While waiting for the demining team, one of the Marines wanted to comment on their silence when asked about 9/11.
So that not so much eerie, but understood silence between each other. Reminds you of all why you're here and exactly what you're doing here. But some of us still have a personal vendetta with the beings that roam here, being the Taliban, and still connect that to 9/11. I do myself. And here comes the 10-year anniversary, and I still find it very personal.
The lieutenant also had a few words on what the Afghans might think of 9/11.
I think at this point, in a sense, it is ancient history to them, and rightfully so, because their problems are very much in the here and now. Problems of security, problems of economics, etc. which are perhaps a result of September 11th, but far removed at this point. Osama bin Laden isn't ruining these people's lives.
But our conversation was cut short by an unexpectedly early detonation.
Roger!
Oh, that's so awesome.
The following day, I get a first opportunity to ask a couple of young Afghan men what they know about 9/11.
Yeah. No, they never heard about this.
Yeah? Can you show them a few more? And can you ask them, do they know where it is even?
Say we're foreigners. Again, we're probably just working in our field, so we do nothing. We don't know about anything else about the world. We don't know, so that's because we're a foreigner. We never heard about anything else about the world.
Adam, if you don't mind, I got a couple more questions for
Sure.
these guys. Just wanted to show them with these pictures. As you know, we're here for your security, but your security is tied to our security. By keeping this area safe, keeping your family safe, we keep our family safe, and that's the reason that we're here. Big time motorcycle coming through.
The two young men had clearly never heard of 9/11, but maybe the elders of the local shura would have more to say.
Yeah. No, they didn't see him. They're saying I just can see the smoke from the buildings, and that's it. That's the only thing I can say. When you guys show this picture, that guy saying it's, I think that was a Kabul.
If I had just gotten here, I would have been surprised, but having been here now for 6 months, I'm not. This is pretty much the Stone Age is where we are.
And what did you think about their reactions?
Oh, I thought it was fascinating. The guy who said it was Kabul was clearly had never been to Kabul. It just shows you how isolated they are, even in their own country. It was nice to go from Iraq to then here. It was a lot easier to understand, why you're here and bring yourself. You had that picture. You can always pick up the picture to remind yourself, okay, this is why we're here. I don't like looking at those pictures. I haven't looked at those pictures. I've intentionally avoided those pictures for 10 years now. So to see them pulled out here and to see the Afghans looking at it in this context while wearing the uniform and carrying the rifle it took me back.
They're saying the Americans saying we're gonna help you. They destroy one building and they destroy us how many buildings? And they say we're gonna help you. Where is the help?
I do sympathize or understand what some of them were saying is, yeah, your buildings were knocked down, but how many of our buildings have been knocked down? And so when you can't even feed yourself or house yourself, how are you going to care about somebody 6,000 miles away? So I can understand that.
Okay, let's pause it there, Emily. Thank you. So, panel, would you like to react? Edward, Lucy? With the question that's all brought us in here is, how do the Afghan people view the last 10 years? How does that instruct your answer to that general question?
Well, it doesn't surprise me at all for the countryside, because most people haven't got television in the countryside, so how are they supposed to see the buildings? But it also shows that perhaps despite all the media support and outreach, even with BBC World Service, VOA, and so on, and Tolo, and that somehow the message of the American or the coalition message is not getting out.
I think what I get from that, I'm not surprised at all about the Afghan reaction, but what I get from that is that the American soldiers' reaction, that they feel that the reason why we're there is because of 9/11, and I think that one has to see it in a slightly more nuanced way. I mean, Afghanistan was a failed state. It was a failed state when I was there during the Taliban period. This was partly why they were hosting Al-Qaeda. That we have failed to differentiate. That there were different people who joined the Taliban for different reasons. It was a stratified group. And it wasn't that the Taliban were all terrorists, but when you see some of the reaction of the military, you would think that that was the case. And for me, that was a worrying reaction.
Dawood, does it mean for all of us that we should say that Afghans, many of them have just been at war for at least 50 years, whosever war it is, whether it's civil war, whether it's an international ISAF war, whether it's the Taliban killing women for daring to show their face, it's the same sort of war, 50 years of it, with a different name. Would that cover many of the people in Afghanistan?
Not 50 years. Afghanistan was one of the most peaceful countries before the Soviet invasions. So some of you might have gone in the 70s and 60s, or some of you might have met those who gone on the hippie trail. They would go to Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey, and back to India.
There's an old hippie laughing on the panel, I think.
So it was one of the most peaceful countries before
so 40
79.
years.
79.
40 years of
before
war.
79.
It's not much better, is it? I mean, my question is it just a constant war, and these guys in the country, these buildings in New York versus Moscow, I mean...
For 30 years it's the same, but I did more or less something similar in the US. I gave a lecture in a university in the US. I asked them that, what do you know about Afghanistan? They were telling me that Osama bin Laden is from Afghanistan. They didn't even know that he was from Saudi Arabia. And none of the 9/11 hijackers was from Afghanistan. So they thought they were Afghans. They hijacked the plane and they were responsible for that.
What's interesting is that I think a lot of the US and coalition forces, particularly right after September 11th, they did not understand the fact that Afghanistan was caught up in a civil war. And the Taliban were one of the factions in the civil war against the United Front or Northern Alliance, whatever we're calling it. And there was this, I was up there for National Geographic to see Masood. I never got to see him. I left early, missed getting probably wounded and killed when he was assassinated. I went to the States in September and October, and actually was at a friend of mine's dinner here. It was like being in the McCarthy era. You couldn't speak, you couldn't question the bombing. The fact that the Americans assumed that the Taliban were the same thing as Al-Qaeda. And you know, there is this expression, you can always rent an Afghan, you cannot buy him. They will take, every faction is taking support from whoever is willing to give it. And I think this is one of the key problems of that period.
Can we all talk about this, including to you in the room? This question, Edward, of whether or not this is one episode in at least 40 years of war, can we make a case that that is what it is? For many Afghans,
it's ongoing
someone's
war.
been shooting at you, whether it's your own guys or someone.
I think so, absolutely. I mean, I think the war began in the summer of 1978 and has continued in different ways. I mean, you can talk about one war or wars, and it's just a new, I mean, you know, we had occupation during the 80s, and now we have, in one way or another, we have another type of occupation in 2011. You know.
Well, violence has become part of life for most Afghans, but the problem is that they blame outsiders. There was the Soviet invasion, there was, after the Soviet withdrawal, the predatory neighbors used one faction against the other, then again they were blaming, and they're still blaming foreigners, whether they're neighbors or whether they're NATO forces killing civilians. But there's always an outside actor playing or using Afghanistan as a field for their own strategic interests.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I was a child, maybe I was like 3-4 years old when the war started in Afghanistan. So since then, I was hoping that my children will see some days of peace. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and my children are also growing up in the war. But at the same time, I think, yeah, this is true that we have gone through a lot of problems and atrocities. I myself, I have been witnessing a lot of atrocities through my life, and I want to get back to the point that Lucy made earlier about the lack of justice in Afghanistan. The reason that we are seeing the prolongation or prolonging of the war in Afghanistan is simply because of the lack of justice. People who were perpetrators, they became victims, and they became perpetrators, and they became victims. And this circle will become bigger and bigger if we are not delivering to the Afghans justice, if we are not holding accountable people who committed massive human rights violations in Afghanistan into account for what they have done in the past. Right now, the Afghan parliament, of course, the 2 elections were a success in the eyes of the international community and also some Afghans. At least instead of using guns, we are going to the ballot boxes. But at the same time, we should also remember that more than 50% of the people who are occupying parliamentarian seats in Afghanistan are the human rights perpetrators who have committed massive human rights violations during civil war, during Russia, and even now.
So the question that's brought us all in the room is to ask about the Afghan people. Do they want justice awful perpetrators of atrocities? Is that high on the list? People in the room have surveyed them. Edward, Lucy, Dawood?
I think justice, as you said, is really key, because it goes back to the communist period, the Khalq, the Parcham period, massacres like Kerala, the shelling of Kabul, the battle for Kabul, the Taliban, who, as we know, a lot of the Taliban were welcomed at the beginning because there was such, I mean, the jihadists had no law and order. They welcomed the Taliban. The Taliban then went to primarily Pashtun, then began to repress the Hazaras, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and others, and it's just gone on and on and on.
Yeah, I mean, the Afghans definitely expressed the desire for justice with the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission report, a call for justice, which I think was issued in 2002 or 2003. But the international community have utterly failed on this, and we have been very complicit, I believe. And that's why it shocks me to see young American soldiers who were probably less than teenagers talking about 9/11 and you know, why they're there. Because I was present at the emergency lawyer Durga in 2002, and I've started my book with this because for me that was a defining moment. It was when many people who'd been elected in a pretty democratic forum came to Kabul to choose their government, to start the state building project, to decide on the constitutional drafting committee. And suddenly you had a situation where all these warlords showed up in their vehicles with their RPGs and their bodyguards, literally bashed through the ISAF entry into the site. And they had just made a Faustian deal with the UN and the US, and they had been promised that the king would be sidelined and that they would basically be able to take over the reins of power and avoid facing justice. And I know I keep banging on about this, but you know, I really feel that we have lost all credibility now. It's 10 years down the line. It's very late for us to now start saying, right, we're going to hold you to account. We're going to have panels in the way that we had in the Balkans. We're going to bring you to the ICC and so on. And I think that is probably the biggest example of Western hubris in Afghanistan since 9/11, that we have made these guys our allies, essentially.
Well, most of the surveys show that most Afghans want justice. But in 2001 and 2002, they were discussing the question of justice versus stability. So eventually they went for stability. And most of those who were accused of all sorts of things, human rights abuses and killings and all the nasty things, were US allies. They became high-ranking officials. So they got the protection. Some of them went into the parliament, some of them became high-ranking officials. So there was no justice. So bad governance that we have today in Afghanistan is the result of the decisions made in 2002 and at the end of 2001.
Yeah, I just wanted to re-emphasize that I'm glad that you mentioned about the UN. I think in emergency lawyer Jirga in 2002, Mr. Lakhdar Ibrahimi, the UN special kind of envoy or UN Secretary General, special envoy to Afghanistan, said that we cannot sacrifice peace for justice. And that statement came after enormous request from Afghans that we want justice and we want these people to be held accountable. But unfortunately, after 10 years, we lost the peace and we lost the justice. So again, I will emphasize that we haven't lost the opportunity. The opportunity is still there. So still there is a time that we should recall back to the promises that international community made to the Afghans in 2001, and also which was delivering human rights to the Afghan people, protecting women's rights to the Afghan people. And yeah, I think this is really key.
Yes, you said it. No, you can come back to more, but we're going to, I wonder if you would all agree then that you've told us the positives, and we're going to discuss the future in a moment. But if you look at the past decade, there was a lot of blood spent, British, American, international, Afghan, and there's a sort of failure of leadership, I think you're saying, both within and without. Is that another point of consensus? Half of us were looking at Iraq for 6 years. Then we've had an inquiry over here about Iraq whilst the Afghan war's been continuing. Is it another point of consensus for our audience among you that despite things happening on the ground, the ball was dropped by international leadership? And would you like to, if you agree, name names, and we'll take some debate from the audience. Dawood, would you like to comment, and we'll go down here?
Well, I think there are some good examples and bad examples. We cannot generalize. There are excellent examples of good governance. In
Name one of each.
Well, I know some officials and some departments which are functioning very well, but we cannot generalize that all the government officials are corrupt or all the government institutions are functioning badly.
Well, I was told by an Afghani, you have to pay a bribe to pay your electricity bill.
Well, in some cases, yeah, this is true.
Well, you have to pay people to take money off you, I was told. So just give me a good example, one bad example, and we'll go down the panel of leadership.
Well, people are high-ranking officials or some officials in some parts of the country are serving people. They are delivering services, but this is not, of course, true in all of Afghanistan. But there are some good examples and a lot of bad examples.
Lucy, I'm asking you about international leadership and Afghani leadership.
International leadership, I haven't got a huge deal to say in the positive, as I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and exploring it in the theme of my book. I do continue to think that one of our worst mistakes was this realpolitik, this idea of basically hiring these warlords to do our dirty work in the short term, not thinking medium to long term about it, and then wondering why the place is so corrupt and there's so much intimidation and corruption in the regions. So that's on the negative side. On the positive side, I mean, there have been some good Afghan technocrats. I think a lot of them have come from the Afghan diaspora, which in itself, I think, brings problems because they often have this sort of modernizing ideas which perhaps conflict with people who stayed behind during the Civil War and during the war against the Russians. And so, yes, I mean, that still also does bring its divisions with it.
I think that the war in Afghanistan was totally unnecessary. What happened was that during 2001, you had Abdul Haq, you had Masood and others who were trying to put together this anti-Taliban alliance. There was definitely a move amongst a lot of Pashtuns ready to quit the Taliban. It was imploding. We all knew that. Masood, for example, went to Paris in April 2001, met with the Americans, and explained to them that you've got to put pressure on the Pakistanis and the Saudis. You also should not, and this has been the repeated message, whatever you do, don't involve yourselves militarily, which they did. This was totally and utterly ignored. And the result is that, I mean, an interesting figure, that almost as many coalition troops, even forget the Afghans, because we're dealing with, when you're talking to Americans sometimes, almost as many coalition troops have now died, or been killed in Afghanistan in theater, as people were killed in 9/11. And and this has gone on from one step after another. The Bonn Accords imposed from above, putting in, appointing an Afghan as an American ambassador was one of the most disastrous mistakes, because every Afghan knew this man's baggage. They knew who he was, and you don't appoint an Afghan to represent the United States in Afghanistan. And they missed a huge opportunity with the king. The king was probably the most popular figure, not because he was a great king, he was a lousy king, but he represented this period of nostalgia.
So thank you. And to you now, we're asking about the past decade, and we'll get on to the future in a minute. Would you like to one question here and one in the front?
Can we have just a general panel view?
Yes, you're going to have to use the microphone, or you will have no answer.
A general panel view of Lucy's assertion about the big turning point was the realpolitik of using these warlords. Was there, at that time, if we can try and remember back to it, was there really a choice not to?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, there was absolutely a choice. And I think that the United Nations missed an opportunity. There were two organizations recognized by many Afghans, and that was the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the United Nations. I think many Afghans were quite prepared, before this decision was made, to actually perhaps have the UN administer Afghanistan for 2, 3, 4 years, with perhaps the figurehead leadership of the king, who wouldn't have led, but he would have been there as a figurehead of this period of peace. And because Afghans were so tired of war.
Right, general panel view to this gentleman.
You've touched upon the core subject of my book, which was what was the alternative, and there was an alternative by the time of 9/11. It had been worked on for 2 years. It was led by Commander Abdul Haq with the ex-king. They'd had meetings in Bonn, in Istanbul. They'd brought all factions together. He'd met with General Masood, Commander Masood, in July 2001, who had bought in with the plan. And it was an internal solution that relied on an internal toppling and defections by Abdul Haq's commanders who he'd worked with during the 1980s, many of whom were in country with the Taliban, some of whom were providing the bodyguard to Mullah Omar at the time, but it relied on the West not bombing Afghanistan, because that would change the whole fabric of the country politically overnight, it would mean that a lot of the guys he'd made his deals with would sort of go back to their villages and their families, leaving the
sorry to
extremists
interrupt,
in charge
Lucy,
of the guns.
not all of us will know who Abd al-Haq was. Can you explain who he was in a sentence, and then let's hear the rest of the...
He was basically the Pashtun commander during the 1980s who took the fight to Kabul against the Soviets and was a moderate and very well respected and a national figure.
Popular military resistor
Had
of the Soviets.
not taken part in any atrocities during the 90s.
Well, I think that the US or the international community had the option to sideline those who are accused of human rights abuses. And this was the least that they could do, because people expected justice. They couldn't deliver the justice. At least they could have sidelined these figures. And the other point that I wanted to make about insecurity is it's not only the bad governance. This is just one element of insecurity that caused insecurity. The other two elements are there was no proper peace and reconciliation program in Afghanistan after 9/11 or after the Taliban regime was toppled. And the second was the mistakes made by the international community, killing civilians, night raids, violating traditions and cultures. And these were then exploited by actors in the region, and they supported different insurgent groups and commanders. And this is the situation that we have today.
Thank you. You've added a very important second point about collateral damage, so-called deaths of civilians, and you answered his question. Would you just answer his question, and then we'll go on?
I'm just answering the question. Like, yes, there was an alternative, but unfortunately the international community, particularly the USA, went after the option of good human rights abusers and bad human rights abusers. So they decided to go with the good human rights abusers and ally themselves with them, who were having blood of Afghans in their hand, and then they were fighting back Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Like, I can give you examples of people such as Northern Alliance or Hazrat Ali or Gulagh Shirzoi from Kandahar, or many other countless, including Dostum. So yes, but the alternative was that, as Edward mentioned, Afghans were ready to have the United Nations administered Afghanistan, and the United Nations peacekeeping forces should have been deployed to Afghanistan to keep the security. Unfortunately, it didn't happen.
So we're on the past decade. It's to you in the audience at the moment. To you, sir.
My name is Sam Zarifi from Amnesty International with Horia. I was at the emergency lawyer Jorga with Lucy. You didn't mention Zalmay Khalilzad, whom I believe is personally the most culpable for doing all this. Would you guys say, looking back, that Khalilzad and Brahimi are most to blame in terms of the international community at kind of the fiasco that happened over the next 10 years? Do you think there's anybody more culpable in that? I guess as a jury, I'm just curious to know, if you were to pin the blame on a couple of people, who would it be?
Well, I think you can go to Cheney and company as well. I mean, you know, Khalilzad was the US ambassador. I don't think he knew that much about Afghanistan. And I think Brahimi was not a very strong character, and I think he allowed himself to be led. So, I mean, there were a lot of factors, but I think Khalilzad as an ambassador certainly had, but I think it came really from Washington and from London in many ways.
We'll take some more audience and come back to you.
Well, when we start talking about whether there was an alternative, it starts on the premise that the Americans actually wanted there to be an alternative. The Americans didn't go in to actually help Afghanistan. That wasn't an option for the Americans, and that's where the problems of Afghanistan today have started.
Right, and you're forgetting that we began with life for women that's now livable, telephones where there were none, roads where there were none, television where there was none, and you're saying that's all an accident.
I'm not forgetting that, Paddy. I'm not sure I entirely agree with all of that, but I'm not forgetting it. I think the points that Lucy made were very, very well made. But if we watch that excellent film, I think that really goes to the heart of the problem of Afghanistan today, that the Western forces that are there are not really there to look at Afghanistan and put Afghanistan right.
I don't think anyone who's been involved with Afghanistan, any of the powers, whether the Chinese, the Americans, the Pakistanis, the Iranians, I can give you a list of 4,500 people. They were not there for Afghans. They're all there for their own agendas, and I think that's quite accepted. But I do want to say, just talking about responsibility of Afghans, I think Afghans also have responsibility, which they haven't. I mean, they're a traumatized nation, I think, in many ways. But they have to face up as well to their own responsibilities.
Rams, just a quick point on Afghanistan. I know everybody's telling me my life story here, but the point is that beginning 2002, America started a war in Afghanistan, which was everyone saying unnecessary. But the point is that you actually found the leader in Pakistan. When will you actually find the real enemy?
Well, that's a
and who is sucking the money out of the West?
Okay.
And at the same time hitting them back.
Right. Thank you for your question. Can you keep the microphone a second? What's your own experience in this matter? What's your own interest in this matter?
I lived in that place.
You lived in which place?
Kabul.
For how long? When did you leave and why?
I can't tell you that, but 27 years.
So were you born there?
Yes.
Well, what's your answer to the question? Being that you are Afghani, we've all come to ask you, how do Afghan people see the last decade of war in your country? Will you answer the question yourself for us?
Complete mistake.
What about how we began with all the positives, the list of positives?
Which ones? Can you list?
We can list them again if you weren't here. Women are not now beaten up for being women. There are telephones, there are roads, there are televisions. There's the start of civil society. There's the creation of some sense of justice. These were all listed by the room earlier.
True, but you have to remember that that country was already suffering from 20 years past war.
Would you feel different if you were a woman?
I don't know. I don't think so. I'm not a woman.
No.
So you got to ask that question from a woman.
Well,
but I do. I have witnessed all those scenes.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we've heard a contribution there. Would you like to react to it?
Well, I would like to react to Sam's point that he made earlier, that who is responsible? One or two individuals. I don't think individuals are responsible. They were looking for consensus everywhere. That was the problem. In every case, whether it was a cabinet, whether it was a ministry, whether it was an organization outside the government structure, they were looking for consensus everywhere. So they wanted to make everybody happy. So that was the main problem. And then there were different actors with different agendas. For example, neighboring countries were also represented in Bonn Conference, Bonn 1 Conference. Pakistan was there, Iran was there. They had their own agendas. And different Afghan factions had their own agendas. The UN had its own plan. The US had its own agenda and plan. So they were all looking for consensus, and they didn't want to make any of these factions or actors unhappy. That was the main problem.
Okay. Lucy, I think you're broadly agreeing. Do you mind if I move on? Yeah. We've got 25 minutes left to discuss the future. So I wondered if the correct bridge is this question, which brought us all into the room. How much faith do the Afghan people have in Allama Tarzai and the government? Would you like to begin?
Such a difficult question. I do believe that Afghans have very little trust to Allama Tarzai's government, and his government have lost its credibility to a very long extent. And this is because, first of all, Allama Tarzai have engaged itself with the warlords and human rights perpetrators. He never delivered justice to the Afghan people, and it kept a kind of putting back, or a kind of putting his back to the promises that he made to the Afghan people. And this is why he lost his legitimacy among the Afghans. Even today, if you talk to the Afghans, of course, I was going back to, someone asked me that if Afghanistan is going to have the same level of a kind of public demonstration that happened in Middle East against Karzai, I said no, because unfortunately we don't have an alternative to Karzai.
I mean, Karzai was initially a PR guy, and we have to remember that. I mean, he did not have the sort of support that and reverence that Abdul Haq had, and in many areas where Masood as well. I mean, Karzai was not a man who was really a born leader in a sense, but he served the purposes of the West very well. He dressed well, he was charming, he was someone you could trot out at salons, and he's a bright guy. But the thing is, the corruption has set in, and I do want to point out that, there are, within the various ministries, there's some excellent Afghans who are trying very hard. The corruption is also extremely broad as well.
Hamid Karzai lost his own brother. I mean, and other people known to him. He's suffered for his country as well.
Yes, but that's the way it is. But the fact is, the family has enriched itself, quite well through that,
and I think the family were very ambitious about being in this position since very soon after the Bush administration came to power. I mean, from my investigations, it seemed that they were quite willing to sideline the king very quickly. The Karzais were part of the Rome group, the Rome process, which was about bringing back the ex-king as a sort of symbolic figurehead beneath which tribes would unite. But the Karzais were the first really to sort of, in a sense, turn their back on this process in order to possibly enrich themselves and to have the top position. And despite the fact that people like, Abdul Haq, who was the key commander, who had this reputation well earned from the 1980s, from his role in Kabul, that in fact Karzai, who was sort of almost the T-boy, I think, at that stage, was able to sort of push these people aside. And I think since 2001, 2002, he's been in an impossible position because he didn't have that history in jihad and that respect from some of these power holders. And as a result, he's had to barter power and sinecures in order to stay in power. And he's there as a figurehead.
Is he right, as our friend at the back said, that you've got the wrong war in the wrong place? When you wanted Osama, and he's pitched up in Pakistan next to the staff military college. So thanks very much, guys. But although you may not like me and you may call me corrupt, I would like you to realise that you've been doing all this in my country, and you have a great debt. He's been saying that publicly, and the West don't like it.
I think he's been very consistent in saying that the West should deal with the safe havens, with the sanctuaries. This is what he's been saying from day one. The second point that he's been saying from day one is don't kill our villagers, don't bomb our villages. And the third point that he's been making since day one is, again, he's very consistent that don't arrest, don't create more Taliban for us, because the night raids and everything. And his cousin was killed by NATO before his brother was killed by the Taliban. His cousin was killed by NATO by mistake. But when we come to Karzai as a person, as a leader, is he to be blamed for whatever mess there is in Afghanistan? I don't think he's alone. There were several centers of power in Kabul, and there still are many centers of power. So Presidential Palace was not making all the decisions. You mentioned different players earlier, so they were also making appointments, they were also making key decisions. So there isn't one person to be blamed for the mess. All of them share the responsibility.
Hello, my name's Rahana Popal, and I actually interviewed Ahmed Wali Karzai a couple of months ago before he was assassinated. And he also brought forward the same similar points to which was put forward by you and by the gentleman at the back. He said the biggest problem when it comes to Afghanistan is Pakistan, full stop, no questions about it. And I think in relation to Ahmed Karzai's government, I think they've done an actually okay job in the position that they're in, because at the end of the day, they're in a country that never had anything. It was war-torn from 30-odd years of war, and he came in and he tried to establish some form of government whilst there was a war going on. So we need to take all of this into context when assessing if the Karzai government was successful or is it any good. And I don't think, in my opinion, that Afghanistan is ready for democracy in any shape or form, that when the international forces withdraw from Afghanistan, Karzai needs to still be there, because it's Afghans are used to sort of continuously. So in other words, if they continue to be the same leader, they might be able to respond, and they're better at building a country.
Did Ahmed Karzai know he was going to be killed? Did you get the impression he knew he was going to die?
I can't disclose that. Sorry.
You can't, okay. So how will, with withdrawal approaching, how do Afghans see their future and the future of the country? Who'd like to start us off on that, with withdrawal approaching? You set us up with some positives. You told us the mistakes of the past decade. You've reflected on Hamid Karzai. We've got about 15 minutes left. The Americans, the British, everyone else is leaving within 2 years. How do Afghans see that departure?
Yeah, I think in the discussions and talks that I have with many Afghans across Afghanistan, it doesn't matter whether you're from the south, east, west, or north. The biggest fear is that if the international community or the international forces leave, then what is the legacy of their leaving? Are they going to leave us institutions that are strong and can protect Afghans against any harms? Are they going to leave Afghanistan in a situation that we are able to restore rule of law in the country and to be able to have a functioning government around Afghanistan? So this is the biggest fear. And also what we are really concerned is that maybe after the withdrawal of the international forces, Afghanistan may fall into another civil war if the right institutions and functioning government is not left in place.
And when the last foreign uniformed boot leaves, is life for women going to change that night?
Definitely yes, and this is the concern of many, many Afghan women. It's being increasingly raised. Even now, many Afghan women believe that ahead of the reconciliation and talks with the Taliban, there are already behind doors discussions and compromises that are happening, which is, unfortunately, women's rights will be sacrificed. And this is the biggest concern and fear among Afghan women.
With withdrawal approaching, how do Afghans see their future and the future of the country?
Well, I think the emphasis within the military is to actually stop viewing Afghanistan through this lens of the military as being the solution. It's got to move more back to recovery. I mean, we can't get back to 2001, that's impossible, but we can get back to the basics. And I think a more intelligent recovery, development, including investment, but more intelligent investment. And this does not mean bringing in these massive outside corporations who require mercenaries who are totally corrupt. I mean, and that's the thing we have to recognize, that the corruption within these American and some European companies is enormous. Massive overhead, 70%, 80%, 90%, 50, 60% going on security. If you cannot operate in Afghanistan without security, you shouldn't be there. And, but it's a long process. It's a 20 or 30-year process. And I think we need to really look to see what is working, what is not working, focus more again on the countryside. Afghans, I think ordinary Afghans, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. They're caught between the military, the coalition forces, they're caught between the insurgents. And I think we have to drop also the labels of Taliban, because you've got Haqqani, you've got Hezb-e-Islami, you've got, I mean, you can just go down the line. Some of the aid agencies, such as the Swedish Committee and others, I'm sure some represented here, they basically look at the individuals concerned. These are all, whether they're insurgents or not, they are fathers and they have children, they have wives, and that's how you've got to take the approach now.
But what's your answer to this question? How do they view life after withdrawal?
I think many people are very worried.
But are you also telling us to look at the word withdrawal differently? We can take the troops out, but leave players behind.
We should not do what we did in the early 1990s, just totally abandon Afghanistan. And that was, again, another one of those big mistakes. You need, I mean, the West or the international community needs to remain involved in Afghanistan, but in much more intelligent manner, and not throw, I mean, it doesn't need these billions of dollars being thrown at it. It needs intelligent development.
And we're now spending 250 million a day. I think since the surge started, it was 100 million a day on military operations in 2008. But yet, when we leave, I mean, so much of the focus, as Ed says, is through the military lens. And as a result, a lot of the idea is, a lot of the discussion is about transition over to Afghan national security forces. But and I think Afghans are rightly terrified about what's going to happen when the international community leaves. I think you saw that through a couple of weeks ago when Haqqanis were attacking the US Embassy in Kabul. People were damn scared. And I could even see that on the BBC report, on BBC World. But I think, I think our failure really has been that we've utterly failed to have any sort of political accord. The government has very little legitimacy with its people. And because the whole emphasis has been on this military approach, I think, quite honestly, when we leave, Karzai's government is not going to survive the 2 years that President Najibullah's government survived with its national army in 1989, because that was propped up for a couple of years. I feel that his government will fall in a couple of weeks.
Right, we'll come to you in the room in a second. This question of the army has been raised. Dawood, would you like to tell us how efficient the army is and how it will be in 2 years?
Well, army has a good reputation. They have a better reputation than the police. But I just wanted to make a quick point about the Afghan problem. It has 3 dimensions. It's not only Afghanistan which has this problem. There is the local dimension, then there is the regional dimension. Afghanistan's problem is mainly regional problem. It's not only Afghanistan problem. There is the whole region. So if we want to resolve the conflict in Afghanistan, we should tackle the whole region. We should have a regional approach. And then the international community comes. And the 2014 deadline says that combat troops would withdraw from Afghanistan by the end of 2014. Afghanistan is now talking with the US about US-Afghan strategic partnership. And there will be Loya Jirga in Kabul very soon. They will talk about the contents of the US-Afghan strategic partnership. So it means that they will stay. They have some role in Afghanistan after 2014.
We're coming to talks with the Taliban next, but we'll go around the room.
Kavi, Paddy, yesterday's agreement signed by...
Please use the microphone really aggressively. Yes.
Signed by Mr. Karzai with the Indian Prime Minister. Now, that has created a new situation because the Pakistan military, which has so far been the main player for of the instability in Afghanistan, particularly in Helmand and Kandahar, are not going to take that agreement lie down. So I would like the panel to give their views. How do they see the situation developing from now on in the context of the withdrawal of major part of the American forces?
Okay, thank you.
And Paddy, let me tell you something. In July last year, I attended a meeting in the in Westminster where General Sir David Richards gave a briefing, and it was attended by a number of MPs and lords and the whole top brass of the British military establishment. One sentence of his, which I have noted down in my notebook, is this, and he was talking about withdrawal of ISF forces from Afghanistan by 2014. He said, we have to divide and rule a bit. And this comment he made in response to a question from the floor, what will happen after the withdrawal of the allied forces.
Thank you. Right. So there's a comment there, divide and rule a bit, but also India's now signed an agreement. Is this very important? Has our friend raised an important point for the future? Would you comment on this?
Well, it's Pakistan's involvement. I mean, Pakistan's concern is not Afghanistan; it's India and Kashmir, and that's the bottom line. If you're looking for bottom lines, however they react with Afghanistan, and ISI has played a double game, still is playing a double game since the very beginning. I mean, I remember I've come across non-stop ISI people inside Afghanistan throughout the years, and just heard the same bloody argument the whole time. I mean, they lie through their teeth. But the fact is, their interest is Kashmir, their interest is India, and however they respond, and I mean, there's no question to my mind that they are sheltering in Quetta and in North Waziristan, Haqqanis. And by the way, the father Haqqani was an excellent commander during the 1980s, who was working with Abdul Haq, and he got lost in the fray because it became another occupation in a sense.
So is this a very important thing as we look ahead? We've come here for a briefing. Watch for India and Pakistan now having a go over Afghanistan. Is that?
I think this will change the situation a bit. But in the meeting, President Karzai said that India is our friend, but Pakistan is our twin brother. So this
what a family!
I think this is a good opportunity for...
Iran's in the family as well.
Yes.
This is a good opportunity, I think, for Pakistan. President Karzai has reached out to Pakistan. So now this is a good opportunity for Pakistan to prove its friendship. There were millions of Afghans when the Soviet troops were in Afghanistan. They were living in Pakistan as refugees. So they somehow lost that goodwill, and there's a lot of suspicion in Afghanistan about the role of Pakistan. So it's a good opportunity, I think, for Pakistan to come clean and help Afghanistan in the peace process.
Anyone else who hasn't asked a question yet to come in? You don't have to, it's not compulsory. Yes, to you, the lady on the far right here. And then we get to talks with the Taliban and closing comments. And if you haven't heard anything in the room that you wanted to, this is a good time to start raising it as well.
Hi, this is a question, since we're on the future topic,
we are.
Actually for Lucy. One of the things you've identified as a concern for the Afghan people and moving forward is justice against the human rights perpetrators. What I wanted to know from Lucy is whether she thinks it would be by public international tribunal or by local law, and whether if it was by local law, by public international tribunal, it would be acceptable to the Afghan people as a solution at all. We all know that those types of tribunals are very protracted and wouldn't render the solution that quickly.
I mean, personally, I think it could have been either. I think in South Africa they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They had similar things in Rwanda where it was more localized justice, village level justice. But in Afghanistan, I mean, these guys were in exile during the Taliban. Many had fled the country because they were so unpopular because of what they'd done during the 90s. I know these guys were also scared during our elections. They didn't feel that they were going to be taking part in the new Afghanistan. And that all suddenly changed overnight. I mean, obviously it had started changing when the CIA started going in with sacks of cash and weapons. But, it could have been either. I think it needed to be something.
To you, and then we'll get to talks with the Taliban.
There've been one American, I think, you're not American, has spoken. It's particularly agonizing to talk about this as an American because of all the people sitting here, everybody can justify their discussions and their opinions and what they're doing. America cannot justify it. We've lost every war since Korea, and there's been less justification in every one. And I mean, I went on the BBC on September 20th, just 9 days, and there were already 12 kilometers headed for Afghanistan. And I said, it can't work, it can't possibly work. I said, it can't work in dinner with Portillo about Bush, that it was a bankrupt policy. So this is a bankrupt war, and we're going right back to the very beginning. And I mean, Godfrey Glubb, who was Glubb Pasha's son, said to me in '96 that the only legitimate power in the whole of the Arab world was the Taliban. And at that point, it was a bunch of university students, and I've heard people from École Normale say even recently that the Taliban are the only credible power in Afghanistan now.
Well,
and we're going right back to the beginning, but there are many Talibans. And I would like to ask the question, how is the Taliban going to view what has been done to them and to Afghanistan? And who are they going to be speaking for? And who will speak to them?
Thank you for asking
that. What
that.
will their legitimacy be?
Can you all tackle this briefly? Because we're coming to a close, believe it or not, with this big question. Ed?
Well, I think it's a very good question.
What's the answer?
Well, the point is that you have many. It's a very disparate movement. And no one controls it. I mean, we keep talking about the Taliban, and you know, a lot of people have joined the insurgency for very, very different reasons, as Lucy pointed out. Some because they weren't compensated for their crops, their poppy crops being destroyed. Others because a cousin was killed or a brother was killed.
Okay,
and so
but
on.
if we break it down, if the Taliban are going to be talked to and might come back, how are they going to view the fact that they were bombed out in 2001?
Further, Paddy, further. David Kilcullen said 4 years ago that the Taliban were already in control of Afghanistan.
Okay, so
you know, I mean, he said they were in control. There were 20 civil governments.
We can't hear you without the microphone. Look, can we just break it down? Taliban, who and what are they going to do? That's the question.
Well, we know who the Taliban are.
Name them.
Mullah Omar is the leader. Mullah Omar is the leader of the main insurgent faction.
And where does he live?
There are a couple of other smaller factions.
Where does he live?
We don't know where he lives. There's the problem. They don't have any address, and there are discussions of opening an office for the Taliban. But the killing of Professor Rabbani changed the situation. So discussions were going on to open an office for the Taliban either in Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, or UAE. But that discussion has stopped now after the killing of Professor Rabbani. The second point is that are there Taliban willing to talk? Yes, there are. Mullah Biradar was the deputy of Mullah Omar, who was talking to the Afghan government. Then he was arrested by Pakistan, and he's still under house arrest. There are a number of commanders who have reconciled, and the former governor of Kunduz province, the Taliban governor of Kunduz province, is now with the Afghan government. He's the director of religious affairs in Kandahar province. So there are a number of successful reconciled cases in Afghanistan. But the problem is, do they have the freedom to talk and where they are? That's the main problem.
I just wanted to mention, when we talk about the Taliban, let's not be too romanticized that Taliban are controlling our Afghanistan. This is not true. And also not to be romanticized that all Afghans want the Taliban. No, this is not true. Because when I have talked even with the people in South Afghanistan, South Afghanistan, what they were saying that we can defend our villages against the Taliban. We can just kick them out of our village, but we don't know if under the new reconciliation process, the same Taliban commander returned as a district governor, then he is going to massacre me and the whole village.
And are they coming?
Second,
no, first, are they coming with revenge on their mind? That was part of his question.
Yeah, I think I can't really answer this question,
okay.
but unfortunately there have been evidences that there are a lot of revenge happening. Excuse me, I'm not finished yet. Yeah, and also when we talk about the Taliban, there are few groups of the Taliban. There is Mullah Omar, there is Haqqani network, there is Hikmatyar network, and at the same time we have cross-border Taliban, which is Hakimullah Masood, Maulana Fazlullah, and Qazi Hussain Ahmad, and so many others who really we want to engage in the talk. Because it's not only Afghan Taliban who have their interest in doing jihad in Afghanistan. Even in the 1990s, when we didn't have one single American or foreign forces, they were still continuing their jihad. So this is really important to see what is also their interest and what we want to give to the cross-border Taliban. Pakistan made the same mistake in 2009 by signing a Nizami Adil regulation with the Taliban in Siwat, but unfortunately it resulted with the expansion of violence across border in Pakistan.
And Horia, you work for Amnesty. You're saying know the Taliban and talk to them. That's what you're saying.
Pardon?
Know the Taliban and talk to them. That's what you're saying to us.
No, this is not what I'm saying. What I'm trying to say is you can negotiate with the Taliban if there is a demonstrated commitment that the Afghanistan constitution is not compromised, women's rights are protected, human rights of Afghans are protected, freedom of expression is there, and at the same time, we should only talk to the Taliban who don't have a blood in their hands.
Okay, so talk to some Taliban.
I think, first of all, we're doing an excellent job in getting rid of all the Afghans, the Talib commanders, with the predators, the drones. But these are exactly the people we should be talking to, or rather the Afghans should be talking to, should not be us. Because the new commanders coming in place are these 20, 21-year-olds who are much more hardline. They've been brought up in Pakistan. In fact, many Afghans complain that these new Taliban, who are Afghan origin, no longer have contact anymore with Pashtunwali. They have no longer contact with Afghan tradition. So you have anyone over 30 saying, these young people, that they don't respect Afghanistan. But we again, I think we have to drop the labels. We have to look at who are the different commanders and begin talking to them as individuals to bring them in.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, panel, would you kindly prepare your closing comments, the things you didn't say, the things that came out wrong, the awful interruptions that you suffered, and if anyone who hasn't spoken had a question about the future or a prediction, we could go around the room and the panel could absorb your comments in their closing remarks. Amazingly, we've got to that point. So if anyone had a point to raise, you've had one already, and so have you. So no, and so have you. You haven't. So it better be good. No, you can have one here, and then because we like to end exactly on time. So you can do it, then you can have one, yeah.
Is it a positive that no one will listen to Britain's Middle East envoy, Tony Blair, when he says we should go into Iran?
We lost the last bit of your...
That no one will listen to Tony Blair when he says we should do something about Iran.
Okay, bear that in your closing comments. The gentleman in the white shirt at the back.
Is the panel certain that the Taliban want to talk?
Okay, anyone else who hasn't? No, you have. Right, so panel, will you address those two comments and make a prediction for us to take away tonight as well? And then, and then anything else you want to do, we'll come back another day.
Well, my prediction is that the problem in Afghanistan is fixable. It's a regional problem. It needs a regional solution. And foreigners should gradually withdraw from the towns and go to their bases or whatever they have and whatever role there might be in the future. And as I said earlier, there are some Taliban who are willing to talk. I gave some examples earlier, but I'm sure all of them don't want to talk. So it's a big movement. They have all kind of people. Some of them are linked with Al-Qaeda. Some of them have different degrees of independence. But there are individuals who are willing to talk. And there are two key events. November Istanbul conference. This will be a regional conference. Regional countries will be talking about Afghanistan. And the second conference is in December in Bonn too. So the fate of Afghanistan or the stability in the region will be decided in these two conferences. We will see whether the players, regional players and international players, are serious to bring stability to Afghanistan or to the wider region or not.
I mean, you people talk about whether the Taliban want to talk. I'm actually not convinced that the government wants to talk. I think that there are elements in the government who are doing very well, thank you very much, out of the international intervention, out of the various schemes for Taliban reconciliation, etc. And there was I felt almost that the killing of Rabbani was, I mean, that had ultimately, he'd been a smokescreen, I felt. I was very surprised when he was appointed to lead those talks. He wasn't well known for sharing power. But ultimately, I think what we have to realize is this is a civil war. It's been going on for 25, 30 years. We did have an opportunity in 2001. It was a window of opportunity to have the ultimate Taliban reconciliation, which was with the Haqqanis and everyone, under Abdul Haq and the ex-king. And I'm afraid we blew it, and I think it's far more complicated now to deal with it.
But something forward-looking from you?
Yes, I won't repeat what the others have said, but I think we have to recognize that Afghanistan also, we have a whole new generation of Afghans who are under 25, majority, 60%. They have different aspirations. They don't particularly trust the people in power. A lot of them are very well educated, in the towns, obviously. Also, they do want something different from Afghanistan. And when I hear also about, Bonn, another Bonn conference, I mean, the first one I think was quite disastrous, imposing everything, and now another one. Just to come back to the question of Iran, I'll just jump on that. Iran is one of the players, and we cannot forget Iran as a player. The question is, will these regional powers, so getting more powerful, I mean, the Chinese are doing their own thing with the copper mine in northern Afghanistan, surrounding it basically with their own security, bringing in their own people from cooks to drivers to engineers, having nothing to do with Afghanistan, threats of pollution. So I think the players still all have their agendas, and I don't think that will be resolved. Just finally, I think Afghans are an extremely resilient people, and most Afghans do have a relative who's got 1 foot in one. I mean, Afghans have got 5 or 6 feet. They've got one in each camp, basically, so they can talk.
Can you give us one overarching thought, a prediction? Because time has defeated us, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think I just want to say about the talks with the Taliban when my friend said, is it possible? I wanted to say that the new generation of the Taliban, unfortunately, they kept killing most of the tribal elders, most of the people who are engaged in the emergency lawyer jirga and in other settlements in Afghanistan, which is very alarming and concerning for Afghan people. And the message that I want to give is the Afghan government and the its international alliances keep saying that we are not going to abandon Afghanistan as we did in the 1990s. But what we are requesting is they should stand by their commitment and they shouldn't abandon Afghanistan as they did in the 1990s.
So we came here tonight to answer how did the Afghan people view the last 10 years and how have their lives been changed. And it's such a massive topic, but I think you've done a great job for us. I heard a lot at the beginning. I think there's a big distinction between men and women. I think our friend admitted he was born there. I don't know. He can't answer the question, would he feel differently if he was a woman? And I think that's an important distinction. You told us about some positives. You said this film, which we saw from Adam Pletz, took many of us by surprise. Thank you for bringing it, Adam. And to all of you pointing to the regional question, our friend who raised the question about India, this was a very good briefing. You mentioned the Taliban and who they were. You did a great job, and I'd like to thank all of you. Horia Mosadiq from Amnesty, Dawood Azami, BBC World Service, Lucy Morgan-Edwards, whose book is here in large quantities, and Edward Girardet, whose book is here. It's only one of them. So, and to you, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.